I've always believed that the best surprises are the quiet ones, not the kind with balloons and shouting, but the kind where you walk through your own front door 2 days early and catch your wife humming in the kitchen, not knowing you're watching. That's the surprise I was looking forward to when my flight from Portland landed at O'Hare on a Tuesday afternoon instead of a Thursday. My wife, Margaret, didn't know I was coming home early. I'd wrapped up the consulting project ahead of schedule, something that almost never happens, and instead of sitting in a hotel room ordering room service for 2 more nights, I booked the first available flight back to Naperville. Back home. Back to her. We've been married 34 years. People hear that, and they either smile like they understand or look at you like you said, something in a foreign language. Margaret and I, we built something real. Not perfect. Not without hard years and harder conversations, but real. The kind of marriage where you still reach for each other's hand during movies you've both already seen. The kind where she still leaves a light on in the hallway when I travel, even though I've told her 100 times I don't need it. I pulled into our neighborhood just after 2 in the afternoon. The maple trees along Crescent Drive had already started turning, that early October amber that makes the whole street look like something off a postcard. I remember thinking how much I'd missed this. The specific quiet of a Tuesday afternoon in our neighborhood, the way the light hits the front porch in October. 31 years we'd lived in that house. Margaret and I had bought it when Daniel was barely 3 years old, when the yard was overgrown, and the kitchen hadn't been updated since 1974. We fixed it up piece by piece. Every room had a story. Every corner had our fingerprints on it. I parked in the driveway and grabbed my bag from the trunk. I was already smiling, already thinking about the look on Margaret's face when she heard the door. That's when I noticed the cars. There were 2 of them I didn't recognize, a silver Lexus SUV and a dark blue sedan parked at the curb in front of our house. I slowed down. Margaret didn't have many visitors on weekday afternoons. Her book club met on Thursdays. Her sister lived in Phoenix. I stood there for a moment, bag in hand, trying to place either vehicle. I couldn't. I let myself in through the front door quietly, not out of suspicion, not yet, just out of old habit. The entryway was dim. I set my bag down and listened. I could hear voices coming from the living room, multiple voices, and I could hear something else underneath them, a sound so familiar and so wrong that it took me a second to name it. My wife was crying. Not the kind of crying you do at a sad movie or when a song catches you off guard. This was a different sound, muffled, restrained, the kind of crying someone does when they're trying very hard not to be heard. I moved toward the hallway. The living room door was half open. I stopped just outside it and looked through the gap. Margaret was sitting in her armchair, the blue one she'd had reupholstered 2 years ago, the one she always curled up in with her tea. She was hunched forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at something on the coffee table in front of her with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not in 34 years. It was the expression of someone who has been backed into a corner and doesn't know which way to run. There were papers on the coffee table, a thick stack of them. Sitting on the couch across from her was a man I recognized immediately, Gerald Whitmore, my son Daniel's father-in-law, a heavy-set man in his early 60s with silver hair he kept too neat, and a way of taking up space in a room that always made me vaguely uncomfortable. Next to him sat a younger man in a dark blazer, someone I had never seen before, with a leather briefcase open on his knee and a pen already uncapped in his hand. And standing near the window, with his back half turned like he couldn't quite bring himself to face his mother, was my son. Daniel is 33 years old. He has my build and Margaret's eyes, those blue-gray eyes that can look soft or serious depending on the light. He was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before. He was not looking at his mother. I pushed the door open. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something fundamental shifts. Gerald looked up first. The man with the briefcase froze. Daniel turned slowly from the window, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, something moved across his face that I can only describe as relief. Like some part of him had been waiting for exactly this. Margaret looked up and her face crumpled completely. "Richard," she said. "One word. My name." But the way she said it, I won't forget that for the rest of my life. I walked into the room. I looked at my son. I looked at Gerald. I looked at the papers on the coffee table. I kept my voice very calm. I have always been a calm man. It is the thing about me that used to frustrate Margaret early in our marriage, and the thing she says she's most grateful for now. "What is going on here?" I said. Nobody answered right away. Gerald shifted in his seat. The man with the briefcase clicked his pen closed. Daniel looked at the floor. "Richard, Gerald started. I'm not talking to you," I said. I looked at Daniel. "I'm talking to my son." Daniel raised his eyes to mine. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had talked himself into something over a very long time and was only now, at the moment of actual reckoning, understanding the full weight of what he'd done. "Dad," he said, "it's not I can explain." "Then explain," I said. "Right now." What came out over the next 10 minutes was a story told in fragments, filled in by Gerald's interruptions and the lawyer's careful clarifications and Margaret's quiet crying, and I had to hold all of it together in my head like pieces of something broken, trying to find the shape of the whole thing. The short version was this. Daniel had debt, significant debt. Not the ordinary kind, not a car loan or credit card trouble, but the kind that comes from a failed business venture and a series of decisions made over 3 years that he had never told Margaret or me about. He and his wife, Serena, had invested heavily in a real estate development company that Gerald had introduced them to. The company had collapsed 8 months ago. Daniel owed close to $400,000 to various creditors, including a substantial amount to Gerald himself, who had co-signed on certain agreements. Gerald's solution, and I use the word solution loosely, was the house. Our house. 31 years of mortgage payments, of maintenance and improvements and weekends in the yard. The house that Margaret had designed the kitchen of, had planted the garden behind, had filled room by room with the accumulated evidence of a life we had built together. Gerald's solution was to have Margaret sign over power of attorney to Daniel, which would give him the ability to take out a second mortgage against the property and use those funds to settle the most pressing debts. Margaret had not agreed to this. She had not agreed to this, and yet here was a lawyer with papers already prepared. I stood there and let all of it settle into me. I looked at my wife. I looked at the faint glassiness in her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands that I had noticed the moment I walked in and had assumed was from crying. "I had been wrong about that. Margaret," I said quietly, "did you have anything to drink this afternoon? Or eat anything you didn't prepare yourself?" She looked at me with something uncertain in her expression. "Serena brought tea," she said. Before she left, she said it was a calming blend. I've been feeling a little strange." I turned and looked at my son. What I felt in that moment is not something I can describe cleanly. It wasn't simple anger. It was something larger and colder and more permanent than anger. The feeling of a man who realizes that the thing he believed to be unthinkable has, in fact, been thought, has been planned, has been carried out against the person he loves most in the world by the person he once taught to ride a bike in this very driveway. "You gave your mother something," I said. Not a question. Daniel closed his eyes. "It was just something mild," Gerald said quickly. "Nothing harmful. A light sedative, just to help her relax and be more open to." I held up my hand and Gerald stopped talking. "I want to tell you that what I did next was something dramatic, that I threw them out immediately or called the police on the spot or said something so devastating that the room shook. But that isn't what happened, and I think the real version is more important than the satisfying version. What I did was go sit down next to my wife. I took her hands in both of mine. I looked at her face, really looked at it, and I made sure she could see mine clearly. "I'm here," I told her. "I need you to listen to me. Don't sign anything. Don't say anything. I'm here." She nodded. She squeezed my hands and she nodded, and some of the terrible expression left her face. Then I stood up and I looked at Gerald Whitmore and the lawyer whose name I still hadn't been told. "Get out of my house," I said. Gerald began to say something about Daniel's obligations, about the seriousness of the financial situation, about how they had only been trying to find a reasonable solution. "I will call the police in 60 seconds if you are still in this room," I said. They left. The lawyer first, then Gerald, who paused at the door and looked at me with an expression that I think was meant to convey that this wasn't over. He was right about that, as it turned out, just not in the way he intended. Daniel didn't move. He stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, and I let him stand there for a long moment after the others were gone. "Did you know about the sedative?" I asked him. A pause. Then, it was Serena's idea. "I didn't. I said I didn't want to. But I didn't stop her. I didn't tell you. I didn't tell Mom." His voice broke slightly on the last word. "I let it happen." "You let it happen," I repeated. "Your mother. You let someone drug your mother." He didn't answer. There was nothing to say to that. "Go home, Daniel," I said. "Don't come back here until I call you. And I will call you, but not today." After he left, I locked the front door and I went back to Margaret. I want to take a moment here, because this is the part of the story I don't tell quickly. This is the part that actually matters most, underneath all the rest of it. Margaret has always been the strongest person I know. People who meet her socially at dinner parties, at neighborhood events, at the school functions we used to attend when Daniel was young, they often underestimate her because she's quiet. She listens more than she talks. She laughs at things other people miss. She has a patience that I have spent 34 years trying to learn from and still haven't mastered. She is not a weak woman. She is not a woman who would simply hand over what she'd spent a lifetime building because someone pressured her. What she is, what she had been in that room before I arrived, was a woman who had been chemically compromised and emotionally ambushed by her own son and her son's family in her own home. That is not weakness. That is betrayal. Those are different things. And I think it matters that we say so clearly. I sat with her on the couch until the glassiness left her eyes, and the trembling stopped. I made her tea, real tea that I made myself, and I told her she didn't have to talk until she was ready. We sat there for almost an hour. The October light shifted across the living room floor. At some point, she put her head on my shoulder. "How did you know to come home?" she asked eventually. "I didn't," I said. "I just wanted to surprise you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the second time you've saved me without knowing you were doing it." I asked her what the first time was. "When you married me," she said. "I'm not a man who cries easily. I'm telling you this so you understand that what happened next was not nothing." I held my wife in our living room and I cried quietly into her hair. From the weight of it, from the 34 years of it, from the particular relief of a man who almost lost something irreplaceable and didn't. Then I got up and I went to the small office off the hallway, the room I use for my own paperwork, and I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Here is something I haven't mentioned yet. About 3 weeks earlier, Daniel had come by the house while I was in Portland. Margaret had mentioned it to me on the phone. She'd said he seemed distracted, that he kept asking questions about the house, about the deed, about whether we had a will updated. I had listened to this with the particular kind of attention that comes from knowing your child's patterns, from having watched someone you love make a series of decisions that worried you. I hadn't said anything alarming to Margaret, but I had made a phone call. I have a friend named Joe Carver who spent 20 years as an investigator before he retired and opened a small security consulting firm. I called Joe, and I asked him to install a camera system in our home. Not hidden cameras, in the invasive sense, but proper security cameras, covering the main living areas, the entryway, the living room. Nothing in bedrooms or bathrooms, just the common areas. Joe installed them in a single afternoon while Margaret was out visiting her friend Carol. I had also, on the advice of my attorney, a woman named Patricia Hollins, who I'd worked with for years on various business matters, taken a step that Patricia had suggested the last time I updated our estate documents. I had placed the house in a revocable living trust, just the two of us as trustees. It's a common enough estate planning tool, but the important consequence of it was that neither Margaret nor I could transfer, mortgage, or encumber the property without the consent of both trustees, and any power of attorney signed by only one of us would not be sufficient to affect trust property without specific language authorizing it. Language that the papers Gerald's lawyer had prepared did not contain, because they hadn't known about the trust. Even if Margaret had signed even in a compromised state, it would have been insufficient. I hadn't told Margaret about the cameras or the trust restructuring. I hadn't wanted to alarm her. In retrospect, I wish I had told her about the trust at minimum. But in another sense, the fact that she didn't know meant she couldn't be pressured to reveal it. Her distress in that room had been completely real. Her confusion had been real. Nothing she'd said or done had given anything away. I went to my computer and I pulled up the camera system's interface. Everything was recorded. All of it. 2 hours and 40 minutes of footage covering Gerald's arrival, the lawyer's arrival, Daniel's arrival, the entire conversation, the moment Serena, who had left before I arrived, as Margaret mentioned, handed her the tea, the expression on Daniel's face when his mother's hands began to tremble, the specific words Gerald had used about the property. All of it. I called Patricia Hollins. She answered on the second ring, which she almost always does. "Patricia," I said, "I need to talk to you about something urgent. I'm going to send you a file." "How urgent?" she said. "Today urgent," I said. There was a brief pause. "Send it now," she said. "I'll look at it tonight." Patricia called me back just after 9 o'clock that evening. Margaret was asleep. I had encouraged her to rest, and she'd been exhausted in a way that still frightened me a little, though she insisted she felt clearer. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, and the specific wide-awake quality of a man whose mind will not stop moving. "Richard," Patricia said, "do you understand what you have here?" "I have a sense of it," I said. "What was administered to your wife, if it can be identified, could constitute criminal assault. In Illinois, administering a substance to someone without their knowledge or consent with intent to facilitate fraud potentially touches on multiple statutes. The financial scheme itself, attempting to obtain power of attorney over someone in a compromised state, that's elder financial exploitation under Illinois law, which is a serious felony. Even if she didn't actually sign anything? Attempt is sufficient in most of these statutes," Patricia said. "And you have video of the attempt. You have video of the substance being administered. Richard, this is not a civil matter. This is a criminal matter." I sat with that for a moment. "What about Daniel?" I asked. Patricia paused. I'd worked with her long enough to know what that particular pause meant. It meant she was choosing her words carefully. "Daniel's exposure depends on what the investigation finds," she said. "His knowledge of the sedative, his presence during the attempt, his role in planning this, all of that becomes part of the picture. I won't sugarcoat it. He is potentially looking at criminal charges." "I understand," I said. "Do you want to move forward?" I thought about Margaret's face when I walked into that room. I thought about the sound of her crying, that muffled, restrained sound, and I thought about Daniel standing at the window with his back half turned. I thought about 31 years in this house. I thought about what it means to let something pass because it's easier, because you love someone, because you can tell yourself a story about how they'll learn without consequences. "Yes," I said. "I want to move forward." The next several weeks were not simple or clean. I want to be honest about that, because I think the stories we tell about things like this sometimes skip over the part that is actually the hardest, which is not the dramatic confrontation, not the legal procedures, but the living inside of it. Margaret took the medical aspect hardest. We had her seen by our doctor the morning after, and while the substance in her system had largely cleared, it was a common over-the-counter sleep aid mixed into the tea at a level that wouldn't trigger acute alarm bells. The documented evidence of what had been done to her was part of the official record. Her doctor was clear in her notes. This was consistent with intentional administration without consent. Watching Margaret sit in that examination room and hear that said out loud, I cannot tell you what that cost her. She didn't cry in the doctor's office. She waited until we were back in the car, and then she cried for a long time, and I sat in the parking garage and let her, and held her hand. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked me, partway through. "To raise someone who could do this?" "No," I said. "You raised someone who made choices. Those are different things." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, and wiped her eyes, and we drove home. Daniel called twice in the 3 days after that Tuesday. I didn't answer. On the fourth day, he appeared at the front door. I saw him on the camera before he rang the bell. He was standing on the porch in a gray jacket, and even on the small screen, I could see that he looked like a man who had not been sleeping. I went to the door, but I didn't open it. "Dad," he said through the door. "Please." "Daniel," I said, "I've spoken with our attorney. This is not a conversation we can have informally right now. You need to speak with an attorney of your own. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" A long silence. Are you pressing charges?" His voice was strange. Stripped down. Nothing performed in it. "Patricia has been in contact with the appropriate parties." I said. You need your own counsel. Another silence. Then, is Mom? She is not available to speak with you right now, I said. When she is ready to speak with you, she will reach out. Respect that. I heard him exhale. Then I heard his footsteps, going back down the porch steps. I stood at the door for a while after he left. I am not a man who pretends emotions away. I won't tell you I felt nothing watching my son walk back to his car that afternoon. I will tell you that I felt something I can only describe as grief. A specific, quiet kind of grief that is not the same as regret, that lives alongside conviction rather than against it. You can know that you are doing the right thing and still feel the weight of it. You can love someone completely and still refuse to protect them from consequences they earned. Gerald Whitmore was interviewed by investigators in November. The lawyer, a man named Frank Calloway, who turned out to have a history of involvement in questionable estate transactions, surrendered his bar license as part of a separate proceeding that got complicated quickly once the state bar became aware of our case. Serena Daniels' wife initially denied any involvement in the tea incident. The camera footage made that denial untenable. Her attorney advised her to cooperate with investigators, which she eventually did. Her cooperation became part of the calculus of what came next. Daniel was charged. I want to say that plainly because I know the instinct in these stories is to soften it, to find the version where love conquers everything and everyone walks away having learned something and nobody truly suffers. But that is not what love actually looks like when you take it seriously. Real love sometimes means watching someone face what they did. Real love, for a parent, sometimes means not making the call that would take the consequences away. Daniel was charged with elder financial exploitation and criminal conspiracy, both serious felonies under Illinois law. Gerald was charged alongside him. The charges against Serena were reduced in exchange for her full cooperation. She testified to the planning, to Daniel's knowledge, to Gerald's role in orchestrating the entire scheme. Daniel pleaded guilty. I was in the courtroom the day he entered his plea. Margaret was not. She had made her decision about that carefully, and I respected it. I sat in the gallery and watched my son stand before the judge and say the word guilty, and I can tell you that I did not feel triumph. I want to be clear about that. There is a kind of story that ends with triumph, with the narrator standing tall over the defeated adversary, and that is not what I felt. What I felt was sorrow. Complicated and specific and very real. The sorrow of a man watching his child suffer consequences that child chose, that were necessary, that were real, the sorrow that does not make you doubt the decision but lives alongside it anyway, permanently. Daniel was sentenced to 3 years probation with significant community service requirements, mandatory financial counseling, and restitution terms. Given his cooperation with prosecutors regarding Gerald's larger role, Gerald turned out to have done this before. To other families, the judge exercised some discretion. The sentence was real. It was documented. It was not nothing. Gerald received a prison sentence. I will leave it at that. Patricia called me after sentencing and asked how I was. I'm all right, I said. And Margaret? She's gardening, I said. I was watching her from the kitchen window as we spoke. She was in her coat, the 1st of November, cleaning out the raised beds on the south side of the yard. She started gardening again yesterday. That's a good sign, Patricia said. She's a remarkable woman, I said. She always has been. I want to tell you something about the house. Because in these stories, the house is always at the center, the symbol, the thing being fought over, the measure of everything else. And it is true that our house was the object of what happened, but I don't think about it that way anymore. I think about it differently now. I was in the backyard one morning about 2 weeks after sentencing, raking leaves, which I have always found unusually calming, and I looked up at the back of the house, the kitchen window where the light was on, the upstairs window where you could see the curtain Margaret made 15 years ago, still hanging, the little covered porch we added in 2009 after a particularly bad summer of afternoon thunderstorms. And I thought, no one was ever going to take this. Not because we were lucky. Not because I happened to come home early, though both of those things are true, but because this place belongs to something they couldn't touch. It belongs to 34 years of a particular kind of love and attention and stubbornness. You cannot transfer that. You cannot mortgage it. It doesn't fit in any document. The legal protections were real, and I'm glad I had them. But what I was protecting was never just the property. Margaret comes out while I'm standing there thinking all of this, a mug in each hand, and she hands me mine without asking whether I want it because she already knows. She stands next to me and looks at the yard. The maples are bare now. The garden is put to bed. The sky over Naperville in November is a particular shade of gray that I've come to think of as the color of contentment. Not exciting, not dramatic, just present and familiar and good. He called, she says. She means Daniel. He has been calling once a week, briefly, leaving messages, asking about us. Not asking for anything. Not yet. I know, I say. I'm not ready, she says. I know that too. We stand there for a while. She wraps both hands around her mug. I drink my coffee. The neighbor, 2 houses down, is also raking leaves, and we can hear the distant sound of it, that particular dry whisper of October debris. Somewhere a dog is barking. Do you think he understands it? She asks me eventually. What he actually did? I think about Daniel's face in the courtroom. I think about the messages he has been leaving careful, stripped down, not asking for anything. I think he's starting to, I say. I think it'll take him years, honestly, to understand it completely. Margaret is quiet for a moment. Then she says, "That's probably right." And there is something in the way she says it that tells me she is already, somewhere deep and private, beginning to prepare herself for a conversation she isn't ready for yet. Not forgiveness as erasure, not forgiveness as pretending, but the kind of forgiveness that 2 people build slowly out of real reckoning, over real time, with no guarantees. That is not a story that ends today. I am not here to tell you it does. What I can tell you is this. I came home early on a Tuesday in October because a project finished ahead of schedule, and I walked into my house, and I found my wife crying in her chair while my son stood at the window with his back turned. I can tell you that I put myself between her and the thing that was happening to her, and that I did not. I can tell you that the hardest part was not the confrontation, not the legal process, not even the sentencing. The hardest part was learning to hold grief and conviction at the same time, without letting one erase the other. I can tell you that Margaret planted tulip bulbs this morning. She does this every fall, puts them in knowing that she will not see them for months, trusting the cold and the dark and the slow work of winter to bring something back. I watched her do it, and I thought that's the most honest thing I know about her, this practical, unperformative faith that what you put in the ground will come back to you. I am 61 years old. Margaret is 58. We are not old. We are not finished. We have, between the 2 of us, a considerable amount of life left to occupy this house, to drink coffee in this kitchen, to watch the light change across these rooms in October and November, and all the months after. No one is taking that from us. Not now. Not ever. If there is anyone watching this who is in the middle of something like what we went through, if you are a parent who feels that the ground is shifting beneath you, that someone is trying to take something that is yours, I want to say this directly. Document everything. Know your legal rights. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And do not wait for someone else to protect what you built. But also, and I mean this, just as seriously hold the grief. Don't pretend it isn't there. The people who try to take from you are sometimes strangers. Sometimes they are people you love. The grief of that second kind is not weakness. It's the cost of having loved genuinely. Pay it honestly, and don't let anyone tell you it means you were wrong to stand your ground. I'm going to go find my wife now. She's probably in the garden, and I want to be where she is.